The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we unpack the party's housing promises for this 44th election campaign. Then, Amanda Monday from the nonpartisan group New Majority on why you absolutely must vote in this election. And disability advocate David Lepofsky on whether this campaign is ignoring the concerns of people with disabilities. That's next on The Agenda. One of the top concerns for voters is housing. From the skyrocketing costs of buying a home to the homelessness crisis, just how do the parties plan to tackle Ontario's housing shortage? Let's ask Jessica Bell, NDP candidate for University Rosedale, Dr. Adil Shamji, Liberal candidate for Don Valley East, and Ashlyn Clancy, Green Party candidate for Kitchener Centre. Welcome to all three of you in our studios. To our viewers and listeners, you probably noticed that we don't have representation from the Progressive Party, Conservative Party of Ontario. We invited Paul Calandra, who was housing minister at the time of dissolution. He did not make himself available, and the PC campaign did not offer any replacement. They did, however, provide us with an email statement, which reads in part, "We need to build homes fast and get shovels in the ground. We need affordable homes, attainable homes, modular homes, and more density around transit. We need to cut through the red tape to speed up approvals and give municipalities the tools to build. That's why we led the charge to remove the HST on purpose-built rentals and eliminated municipal fees on affordable and non-profit housing. We've introduced over $3 billion in new funding for municipalities to support housing enabling infrastructure, including $1.2 billion for municipalities that meet or exceed their housing targets. Ontario deserves a government that will work with municipal leaders to build more homes and protect our families." That is exactly what the Ontario PCs will deliver. All right, with that, I should ask, should we get some thoughts on that in terms of their statement? I'll start with Otto and go from there.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody deserves a place to call home, but under Doug Ford, that has become a pipe dream and something more difficult than ever before to achieve. I mean, if we think about it, the number of people who are homeless today is 10 times what it was in 2018. Housing prices have escalated at a rate 2 times the rate of inflation, and rent has gone up by nearly 50%. So, they can say all of the things that they'd like to do or that Ontarians need, but they have completely been an abject failure on delivering any of those things.
All right, Jessica.
The Conservatives have had 7 years to fix the housing crisis, and like Adil said, we are seeing very clearly that it's not working. We have encampments in towns and cities across Ontario. We have rent at record highs. We have seniors in our riding who have been evicted into homelessness. We have people, high-income workers who are moving to other provinces because they've given up on the dream of owning a home in Ontario. And we're not seeing the government seriously invest in affordable housing. In fact, they're not investing in affordable housing. And everyone who's walked by an encampment knows that full well.
All right, Ashley.
Yeah, affordability is key right now, and increasingly that's a housing cost that people can't afford. So people paying for a roof and food is becoming more challenging. 81,000 people are homeless. And when it comes to building things, I don't think that that's the case. They don't have a great record. Housing starts are down, and for single-family dwellings, we're at the lowest we've been in 55 years. So we need to be bold, and we need all kinds of solutions, and we need to get back in the business of building housing and cut the red tape. This government avoided making fourplexes as of right across the province, which would have been one small step to making sure we can have more units where we already have the infrastructure. They have doubled down on sprawl development, which we know is the most expensive kind of housing and will take the longest to build. So we need to actually take this seriously, follow through on the recommendations that they have ignored from their own report.
All right, Otto, your party has made several pledges about the land transfer tax. Why is this tax significant, and what would you change about it?
Well, one of the things is if you want to make homes cheaper to live in, you have to make homes cheaper to buy and cheaper to build. One of the unnecessary, punitive, and frankly discriminatory taxes that exist right now are the land transfer taxes. And by targeting them in the right way, by eliminating land transfer taxes for first-time home buyers that are struggling to get into a home, for nonprofits that know their communities well and are best positions to develop affordable and deeply affordable housing, and for seniors who live in homes but are looking to downsize. Eliminating land transfer taxes is an excellent way of making it cheaper for people to get into homes and to move into the right homes for themselves. It's one of many ways in which we are seeking to eliminate these discriminatory and punitive taxes. It's so peculiar that Paul Calandra, Doug Ford, and the Conservatives have so much difficulty in eliminating taxes. That is supposedly what Conservatives are supposed to do. Yet they won't eliminate development charges. They won't eliminate community benefit charges. They won't eliminate land transfer taxes. These are things that Ontario's Liberals are ready to do because we are ready and serious to make housing affordable and accessible for all Ontarians.
All right, we heard development charges, so I'm going to pick up on that. Ashlyn, does the current regime need to change when it comes to development charges?
Yeah, I think we've heard loud and clear from AMO that the way we fund municipalities isn't working anymore, and it's disproportionately impacting people trying to get into housing. We need to incentivize people to build kind of starter homes and cut a lot of the red tape that is involved with getting things built within the countryside line, but we need to make sure it's uniform. So we have a focus on creating generational fairness. When I knock on doors, folks who own their own home are often more optimistic and feel like they have enough to pay for a roof and food, but we do need to get rid of those fees. And our first-time home buyer plan will get rid of the land transfer tax, but also development charges on those starter homes, which would save first-time home buyers $150,000. But we have an affordable community fund to make sure that municipalities aren't, again, shouldering the burden, and then we have property taxes in the double digits.
All right, Jessica, I'll get you to pick up on that.
The NDP is very much in support of bringing in tax fairness into the housing sector, which will include eliminating the land transfer tax for first-time home buyers and also increasing the land transfer tax on investors that are buying their third, fourth, 12th home. And the whole reason behind that is because we need to increase home ownership rates, especially for first-time home buyers. By levelling the playing field, we get to do that.
All right, I was going to pick up. We talked about home ownership. I want to talk about rent.
Yeah.
I'm going to come to you, Ashlyn, first. Ontario's current rules say that only units lived in before 2018 are covered by rent control. Would you change that?
Of course, we bring back rent control and vacancy decontrol. It's been tried many places, many times, and has not proven helpful. I had a friend move out of their home because their rent increased by 30% in a month, and they had to move their whole family out of an apartment to find something new. People need to know how to budget their money, and unaffordability is just a pipe dream for so many. We see in my riding, for example, that for every affordable unit we build, we lose 39 in the private sector. So we need to do more to keep people housed and protect affordability, not just bringing back rent control and vacancy decontrol, but making those rent evictions and above guideline increases, put a pause on that, because people are getting squeezed out of the rental, and we see, again, 81,000 people facing homelessness, and that's unacceptable when you pay your rent.
All right, well, let's get our thoughts on the Liberal Party when talk about rent control.
Well, without a doubt, we need to reintroduce rent control for buildings that have been constructed after 2018. But what I want to say is that rent control as a consumer protection and affordability measure just goes part of the way. For example, here in Ontario, our vacancy rate for rental apartments is 1.7%. That is a historic low. And what we need to do, in addition to bringing in fair rent control, for example, along the models that have been employed in Oregon, Manitoba, California, we need to do that, but we also need to make sure that we spur the development of rental housing so that we can get that vacancy rate between 3-5%. What I'd like to see is a situation in which landlords and owners of rental apartments are fighting to secure tenants. That is a great way to bring down the cost of rentals, but also make sure that bad actors that use things like rent evictions or above guideline increases or don't maintain the units properly, they will be forced to, because otherwise they won't be in a position to get good quality renters into their apartments. So it's about much more than, but not only, rent control.
All right, Jessica.
Yeah, these are really good points. The Ontario NDP is in support of bringing in real rent control, strong rent control on all homes, doesn't matter when they're built, and to also bring in a system of vacancy control. So there is a cap on how much the rent can be raised between tenancies. And when we do that, we are giving the 1.7 million households who rent in Ontario stability. It means they're less likely to be illegally evicted because a landlord wants to kick them out and increase the rent by having a new tenant come in. And it means the cost of their rent is stabilised. They can budget, they can plan, they're more likely to be able to pay the bills and pay food. In addition to rent control, it is essential that we build more housing. There's no question we have a housing supply shortage in Ontario, especially when it comes to building affordable housing and rental. We, in our housing platform, have a commitment to bring government back into the business of building affordable housing for low-income and middle-income families and partnering with municipalities and co-ops and non-profit developers to do that. We are also very much in support of easing zoning rules to fast-track the construction of needed housing in towns and cities that people want to live in. We're talking higher density buildings along transit routes and near transit stations. We're talking fourplexes in towns and cities across Ontario. So people have more options, not just for renting, but also for purchasing their first home.
All right, we will pick up on affordable and zoning, but I do want to talk about one question to you in regards to the tenant board, landlord-tenant board. We commonly hear about disputes between landlords and tenants. What needs to happen to the board itself?
Well, what we need to do if we want to make renting fair and accessible to everyone in the province, we need to do things like bring in rent control. We need to spur the construction of more rental units. We need to have a situation in place like, Ontario Liberals have promised a rental emergency support fund or a rent bank. Those things are important, but as I mentioned before, a really important thing is we need to eliminate bad actors from the system, and that means, and those can happen on both sides, on both the landlord and the tenant side, and having a strong and robust landlord and tenant board is critical to doing that. So a number of the things that we need to do, for example, move away from exclusively online hearings. They've got to be online and in person as well, with a reformed pathway for mediation to take place before the landlord and tenant board, before landlord and tenant board hearings take place. And then what Ontario Liberals have committed to is adequately funding the LTB and ensuring that there are enough experienced adjudicators so that we can deliver a 2-month guarantee. What I heard in my constituency office from landlords and tenants is there are bad actors who are abusing existing laws, and the fact that in many cases, people are waiting 1 or even 2 years in order to be able to access justice. That is a unique phenomenon distinct to the Ford government. Under their watch, we have seen the backlogging cases at the LTB balloon massively, nearly quadruple to 53,000 cases. That is an indictment on Paul Calandra and Doug Ford, Ontario's Liberals, by bringing in hybrid hearings, in-person hearings, pre-trial mediation and adjudication, more mediators, and then of course adequately funding it will eliminate that backlog and deliver that 2-month service guarantee.
All right, I want to move away from renting. I want to talk about building homes. Ashton, I'm coming to you because the Green Party has pledged to build 2 million homes in a decade. Mm-hmm. Ambitious, some would say. How are you planning on meeting that?
Well, unlike the Ford government that's going to court right now, or is being investigated by the RCMP for paving over the Greenbelt, wetlands, prime farmland, we have made a commitment to a food belt and not paving over the places that feed us and the places that we love. But we should be building within countryside line, close to infrastructure that's already there, and the places where we work and where we live and where we play. So we've made a very bold pledge supported by OREA. We got top marks from more neighbors as well, because we know it meets the moment. So we want to legalize fourplexes and 4 stories as of right across the province. I live in a neighborhood where that was just the way things were done back in the day. And we know that we can build more density in bigger cities, 6 to 11 stories in cities over 100,000. And this is why the for-profit sector supports that, because as a city councillor, I know that we need to legalize housing. 70% of the province is zoned for single-family dwelling. That is a thing of the past, and we need to use up our breath brownfields, for example, and bring back that remediation. We need to ensure that we can use modular homes and mass timber as a way of getting homes done quickly and cheaply. We know that we don't need to build elevators and use a lot of cement, which makes things more expensive, and make things consistent across the province. Builders all over the place are saying each municipality is left to do things differently, and that creates a havoc in the construction industry. Let's streamline things. Let's cut the red tape for real and add units where we work and play and love.
All right, Jessica, the Ford government is behind on their target of building 1.5 million homes by 2031. What would the NDP do differently?
The Conservative government is very behind on their target to build 1.5 million homes, and it's primarily because they have relied exclusively on the private sector to deliver, and they haven't changed the necessary laws to help the private sector to do that. This is how we do it differently. We'd have a two-pronged approach. First, we are very much in support of measures to speed up the construction of homes by changing zoning rules. Similar to what the Green Party has mentioned, allowing more density near transit, allowing fourplexes and 4 stories as of right in towns or cities so that smaller developers can get into the market and people have choice. These are measures that the BC NDP government has moved forward on. These are measures that we would do here as the Ontario NDP government. But we also need to be very clear that having the private sector alone solve our housing crisis, it's not going to work. We need a partnered approach where the government goes back into the very important role of building affordable housing. An Ontario NDP government would move forward with leveraging public land, financing, grants and fast-tracking approvals so that we can build affordable housing for low, moderate and middle-income families. It's a tried and tested method. It's been used in cities from Vienna to Vancouver. It is time to bring that method back to here in Ontario.
All right, Aldo.
Well, when I think about the housing crisis that we face and the way that we got here, I really think that there have been 2 major categories of failures. The first failure is that there has been inadequate funding of the homes that we need to build. Frankly, there are just too many taxes and too much money being asked to be taken from builders, developers, and ultimately from future homeowners. And so, doing things like eliminating development charges, replacing that with the Better Communities Fund so that municipalities can still have the infrastructure in place to spur that growth. But also eliminating discriminatory taxes like community benefit charges, again, which can inspire and motivate the private sector in order to build the homes that we need in the places that we need it. There's a separate category of failures altogether, and that is the chaotic and unpredictable policy environment that has been created by Doug Ford. Over the last 7 years, there have been at least 10 pieces of housing legislation, each one usually reversing something that was in the last one. I mean, the classic example would, which was not through legislation, but was through unilateral executive action, was the attempt to sell off the Greenbelt, which Doug Ford subsequently walked back on because he was called out and now faces an RCMP criminal investigation about. But we have municipality after municipality after municipality across our great province, all in a housing crisis because there isn't a streamlined approach to policy, to housing policy, to housing planning, and to our zoning. And so, earlier this year when I introduced legislation to make fourplexes as of right province-wide, that legislation was about much more than just fourplexes. What it did was it got rid of a lot of the zoning challenges that take place, setbacks and floor area ratios and parking requirements, all of which are things that in the planning world are poison pills that stop us from being able to build more housing and introduce gentle density. And so our plan looks at not just adequately funding our housing sector and removing taxes, but also creating a streamlined, accessible, and predictable policy planning environment that makes it possible for our housing sector to thrive and fire on all cylinders.
Ashton, did you want to get in on that?
Well, ultimately, I just want to echo what Jessica was saying as well. Like, this government took away HST on purpose-built rentals. Great. What about the HST on affordable housing? Like, our co-op and not-profit sectors are ready to build. Yeah. And we know that we need to have that safety net in order to prevent homelessness. So on two areas, we need to kind of open things up. And municipalities want that. They're shouldering the burden of downloaded shelter costs. It costs property tax owners quite a bit to create these social services and supports that need to be funded by the province and are funded by the province across Canada. So we need to be sure that we get our not-for-profit and co-op housings funded. So we want to build 250,000 nonprofit and co-op homes, but we need supportive housing for folks who have been abandoned by this government, are facing addiction and mental health challenges, and don't have a roof and food. We know people get so sick when they end up homeless, and we're seeing seniors and folks with disability end up homeless at an alarming rate. And the province has abandoned municipalities. AMO has been very clear that property tax is not a good tool for addressing homelessness. It really needs a strategy and a cohesive voice from all partners in the sector to deal with this, because it's so costly to hospitals, so costly to municipalities to pay for shelter beds, and we know shelter is not the answer. Let's follow Winnipeg, let's follow Houston, Texas, and do a housing first approach, because that's really how we can get ahead of this.
All right, Jessica, I'm going to come to you. Mark Stiles has introduced this idea of a government agency called Homes Ontario. What would that look like? How does it look like with the Ontario government sort of involved in building homes there?
Sure. So Homes Ontario would be something similar to Infrastructure Ontario. It would be tasked with the job of building 300,000 homes over the next 10 years that are affordable or non-market. The beauty of Homes Ontario is that it would work, or will work, with municipalities, non-profit developers, for-profit developers, co-ops, to provide the financing and the funding and access to public land in order for the private and the non-profit sector to build housing. In our view, this is necessary because we need an all-hands-on-deck approach. We've tried a system where the private sector has been tasked with building affordable housing. That's been the Conservative government's approach. It hasn't worked. They've built about 1,000 affordable homes over 6 years when we have literally encampments in every town and city across Ontario. We need a different approach. The beauty of this is that it's already working elsewhere. The BC NDP government is doing this right now. Vienna is, many other cities have, and it's time to bring this approach here.
All right, with that actually, Ashley, I'm going to come to you. Should a government agency be in the business of building affordable homes and supportive housing?
I think we need a vision. We know that our co-op and nonprofit housing, they're the pros. They're ready to do this. And developers, we need people to get who can build these kind of homes. Too often it's really we've narrowed the field of who is actually building homes right now. And so it's important that we get all hands on deck. I know I've been approached by so many missing middle developers and not-for-profit and co-op housing saying we need to unlock the potential and resource this. We need to resource the housing. We have 270,000 people on a wait list across Ontario. People, as a social worker, I know people put their lives on hold waiting for affordable housing, and it's such a strain on their life. We have lots of kids who are facing homelessness right now, and we have shelters that are under-resourced. We need to fund women's shelters, because if we don't have the affordable housing for people fleeing violence to go into, people stay in an unsafe environment, or people can't get the benefit of a women's shelter because they have nowhere to go afterwards. So it keeps so many people stuck, but we also need to be sure that we double OW and ODSP. The shelter allowance for OW is $390 and OW is $580. So we need to do the math, and we need to be sure that people can continue to pay their rent. Landlords want people to pay their rent, and folks living in housing need enough money for a roof and food. So let's pay what shelter actually costs.
All right, Otto, I want to get your thoughts on the NDP's plan of Homes Ontario. Is a government agency the answer here?
So, I have a reservation with respect to my colleague, and I appreciate that my two other colleagues are here talking about the housing crisis. And there's one person who's missing here. So, I must give credit where credit is due. That being said, we do differ on the need for a monolithic, bureaucratic, and potentially underfunded provincial government agency that will be in place and able to, and hopefully able to start making a dent on the housing crisis 2 years from now. We have, homeless people and encampments on the streets right now. In my career as an emergency doctor, I served as a medical director in 11 homeless shelters. And what I actually saw is that we need to adequately fund our shelters. We need to ensure that people have access to warm and safe places with wraparound supports. We delivered psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, addiction specialists, and we brought people within the envelope of that supportive care and then watched as people had their addictions issues stabilized and then their mental health challenges stabilized, and then they were able to move on to other forms of housing. We believe there is a housing crisis right now, that shelters, that wraparound supports need to be funded right now. And rather than waiting for a bureaucratic agency to be raised and operational, hopefully 2 years from now, we can do things like eliminating land transfer tax for nonprofit builders and allow them to start building the homes, the affordable and deeply affordable homes that we need today, not months or years from now.
I'll get you to respond.
The Ontario NDP is very clear that development fees on affordable housing and supportive housing and non-market housing should be eliminated. We should be using development fees in a way so that we're spurring the construction of the most needed homes in Ontario. As part of the Homes Ontario program, we have a commitment to build 60,000 supportive housing units so we can get to that issue that you're bringing up, which is how are we going to provide housing for people who have addictions issues, people who have been living homeless for, a few years and who need additional support, social workers, food delivery, to, get their lives in order again. That's part of the program. And a final piece that is important to the program is that, like you, I don't want to wait 2 years for housing to be built, which is why we're looking at what the BC NDP government is doing with their fund to buy up buildings and apartments that already exist and move them over to the non-profit sector so that we can very quickly provide more housing to people that really need it right now and who've been waiting too long.
Mm-hmm. All right. It's very important that when we talk about housing, all three of you have touched on the homelessness issue in this province. As we know, 81,000 Ontarians don't have a permanent home. Part of this conversation is encampments. We've seen over the years that has been a big headline for dealing with this issue. I'm curious, I want to get an idea, Ashlyn, how would your party deal with encampments specifically, but also your plan to target the homelessness issue?
Yeah, we know that this population has been failed. We're hemorrhaging folks onto the streets. So in my region of Waterloo, we've had a doubling of homelessness in 3 years. So the government abandoned that census that was collecting data. We rely on municipalities to do that. And they've downloaded the burden of funding these initiatives. It's essential to our towns and cities, rural and northern communities especially, that are seeing even more growth and rapid increase in homelessness. So we need to support those rural and northern communities especially, but we need to build supportive housing. We know shelters more expensive. Hospitals and jails are more expensive by a country mile. I think hospital bed is $30,000 a month, jail is $13,000, shelter is $5,000 to $6,000, whereas supportive housing operational costs are $4,000. So it's cheaper financially and it's kinder. People get very sick when they're homeless, and so it's important that we look at housing as a solution to homelessness, and we need to make sure that that's funded. We need to make sure people have what they need to stay housed by doubling OW and ODSP, and I put forward as MPP the Keeping People Housed Act, which gets rid of all of these loopholes. We had 4 landlords pay on average of $5,000 in the last 4 years for illegal rent evictions. That's staggering. There's no accountability in the LTB. We need LTBs down to a month. We need to make sure the bad actors are out and create that fairness for landlords and tenants and get rid of those loopholes that displace massive amount of people, massive amounts of seniors and folks with disabilities into homelessness shelters.
All right, Otto, I'll get your take, and as well, I'll ask the same question dealing with encampment specifically.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you deal with homelessness is by building housing with the wraparound supports and services that are necessary for the people who are currently living on the streets or living in encampments. I want to be really clear about something. If we want to eliminate the phenomenon of encampments in Ontario, it's not going to be achieved by violence. It's not going to be achieved by incarceration. It's not dignified, and it's expensive, and it's not effective. What we need to be doing is funding the wraparound supports and services that we need, and then also ensuring things, as Ashlyn mentioned, doing things like doubling ODSP. Absolutely. Making sure that people have access to the primary care and mental health care. We've committed to bringing mental health care, under the purview of OHIP. These are essential steps that can work at addressing the root causes for why we have the homelessness and encampments that we have. But if Doug Ford thinks that his solution is going to be violence and incarceration, it's not going to work. People can't there are, in my clinical practice, there are so many people that are begging for mental health and addictions assistance voluntarily, and they can't get it. So how are you going to impose that involuntarily as well?
All right, Jessica?
I was really deeply disturbed when the Conservatives came out with their announcement that they were going to criminalise people who lived in encampments, fining them, potentially sending them to jail. That's no solution. When we've spoken to people who are living in encampments, we would meet people who were desperate to get a job, but found it was very difficult to get a job when they had to spend half their day looking for food and a place to have a shower. Or we'd meet people living in encampments who had chronic health conditions like multiple sclerosis and found it very difficult to work. They found the Conservatives' comments offensive, and many experts felt that targeting people who live in encampments was just downright immoral. It's our view that we need to have a multi-pronged approach to dealing with homelessness. We need to have a homes first approach by providing enough funding to municipalities so that they can provide shelter to people in the short term as we build and buy permanent homes so that people can move into a place where they can rebuild their lives. And in addition, we need to go upstream and think about how we can stop people from falling into homelessness in the first place. That means bringing in strong renter protections so people aren't illegally evicted or find themselves homeless because their landlord has increased the rent beyond what they can afford. And it's also necessary to look at the income piece. It is good that all three parties are standing here saying that we should double social assistance rates. Many people who are living in encampments who are homeless, they're on social assistance and they can't get by. And it's also time to raise the minimum wage. It is very difficult in Ontario to afford the rent if you are earning minimum wage. It needs to go up so we can address the income inequality that we're seeing in our province right now.
All right. Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But again, some really great ideas there. Thank you again, Ashlyn, Jessica, and Otto, for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Sir.
It might be a pain, particularly in winter weather, but voting is still an essential part of democracy. And with only a few days left in this campaign, we thought we'd provide a little 411 on everything you need to know about how to vote and why. So we're now joined by Amanda Monday, Executive Director of New Majority, a nonpartisan advocacy group. Welcome to our studios.
Thanks for having me.
All right, there's something important happening this week. Tell me about it.
There's an election happening. It wasn't planned, it snapped, but it's here, and it's on Thursday, February 27th.
So Amanda, how can Ontarians vote?
So Ontarians can get to the polls from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on February 27th, Election Day. You can also go to your local election office. Right now, they're open. You can look online on Elections Ontario website to find out exactly where your local election office or where your polling station is.
All right. Are there any other ways that Ontarians can vote? Can we do mail-in? If you're not in the province, are there some options there?
You do have some options. So Ontarians can vote by mail. The deadline to apply for a mail-in ballot was Friday, February 21st. So if you applied for a mail-in ballot, then you need to get that in by 6 p.m. on Election Day. Right. But if you didn't apply for a mail-in ballot, then you want to go in person.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the hows. As you mentioned, snap election. It's a bit cold out there. Some of the snow has melted, but it's interesting to have an election in the winter. If you can't get to the polls because of the weather, what can you do?
Well, you want to make sure that you get to the polls as best as you can. So while you can vote by mail, now it's about getting in person. So you want to make sure that you're looking up your local that you're looking up where your polling station is and making sure that you get there. You can walk, you can go by transit, you can contact a friend to get a ride if you need to.
All right, so let's say we haven't voted yet in the advance polls, we haven't done the mail-in, we are dead set on waiting on election day, because maybe that's how you see democracy, wait until the last minute to kind of assess out the parties. If you're working, that might be an obstacle for some people to get to the polls. If we can't get away from work, how do we sort of navigate that?
It's really important that everybody knows that your employer is legally required to give you 3 hours off to vote, and that polls are open longer than a working day usually. So depending on when you can vote, either before work, during work, your employer legally has to require that you have time off to be able to go and vote, or you can go after work if you're working a standard 9 to 5 or during the day. You can go in the evening and make sure that you get to the polls. We've seen lots of reports that there's been steady traffic, so not really long lines, but it's encouraging to see that people are showing up to the polls, and I would say that don't let lines or timing be the barrier for getting there.
All right, so we shouldn't get any flack from our employers at all.
Absolutely not.
All right.
Your employers are legally required to give you time to vote.
There we go. Once we get there, what should we have in our pockets? What should we make sure? I know some people had received voter cards in the mail, but if you didn't get that, that's not a problem as well.
That's right. So Elections Ontario does a really good job with ID and what you need to vote. So if you have that voter information card, all you need is one piece of ID that has your name on it. So that can be a library card, it can be your blood card, it can be a debit card. It doesn't have to be photo ID. If you don't have that voter information card with you, then you need a piece of ID that has your name and your address. So that could be a pay stub, that could be a utility bill, it can be anything from CRA, anything that has your name and your address. It doesn't have to be photo ID. And what's also important to know is it doesn't have to be physical. So you can use electronic piece of ID. So you can show something on your phone, whether it's a bank statement, anything that's got your name and address, you can vote.
Sounds like there's no excuse to not vote.
There's no excuse, just get there.
All right. Curious if it's your first time voting, anything different that you need to do?
There's nothing that you need to do as a first-time voter. And so sometimes people worry, I didn't register in advance, so I'm not going to be eligible to vote. And especially if you pay attention to U.S. media, you may think you have to be registered in order to vote. That's not true in Ontario. You can simply show up at the polls, and they will help to make sure that they can look who you are up and make sure that you can cast your ballot.
All right. Let's get a little bit of a better understanding of New Majority. What is it?
So New Majority is a non-profit, non-partisan organization that's really dedicated to get out the vote. So what we do is we work on encouraging young people to get to the polls. And what that looks like is what we call elections organizing. So we've got a phone bank where we're calling and we're getting young people to make vote plans so that they can figure out when, how they're going to get to the polls, when they're going to go, exactly if they have work, their transportation needs. And then one of the most exciting activations that we do is poll walking. So that's where we put peers on the ground on campuses all over Ontario to literally walk young people to the polls. So we stop every person that walks by us and we say, hey, what are you doing today? It's fun, it's high energy. And we say, let's go to the polls, let's go. It's your first time, you've never been before. That's okay, we're going, come with us. Let's get to the polls. We can talk to you about ID, we can talk to you about what you need. And then we just simply guide them right to the polling station.
Very nice. I'm curious, why do you think your organization is so important in today's climate?
It's a great question. So in the last provincial election, voter turnout was 43%, which means the majority of this province didn't turn out in the last election. And when we're looking at the political climate right now in Canada and internationally, democracy is so important. And when people don't turn up, it then calls into question who's elected, who makes those decisions, what voices are being heard. And so when I saw the 2022 turnout stats, it was more motivating than ever that my team needs to make sure that we encourage young people to vote. And, it's important for a young person who's never voted before, first time or a new voter, it makes sense that you're unsure of the process. It makes sense that you're not sure about a new system. Political offices can seem intimidating. I don't really know about what that's about. If you're not engaged in politics, you might feel that it's not for you.
Right.
And so our organization really exists to take all of that pressure away and have a really non-judgmental, very logistical, welcoming, easy way to get you to the polls.
Walk me through sort of the added challenge. I know some people might have seen some of the ads now popping up on socials and on ads if they're streaming, but the added challenge of this being such a short window of an election to get young people engaged.
We had our work cut out with us for this election. So it's a snap election more than a year ahead of the planned election date. So our teams needed to move fast. On top of that, last week during advanced polls was Reading Week. So on campuses all over, students weren't there. On top of that, Ontario has been facing some pretty significant weather. And so when we look at just simply getting to the polls, you know, there's 23 publicly funded universities and 24 publicly funded colleges. Guess how many on-campus polling stations there are for this election?
Oh, I don't even know.
There are 8.
That's it.
There are 8. So in Elections Ontario's defense, they've said, well, if they're not a polling station on campus, they're across the street or short distance. But when we're thinking about those mounds of snow, about the puddles, about encouraging young people who've never done it before to get to the polls, I care a lot about where the polling stations are. I care that they're on campus. I care that we're removing barriers to get young people there. And so it really has been important for us to be on campus talking to young people, and we had to put all of those plans in place pretty much overnight.
You mentioned some of the campaigns that you're working on. Can you talk a little bit about the others that you're working on for this election cycle?
So we have phone banking. We've also got relational organizing. And so relational organizing is one of the most effective get out the vote strategies that we've seen out of the US. And that's where we pay young people $150 to text their friends to make vote plans. Because if you think about it, if you hear from a random stranger like me that says, no vote, no say, that might be somewhat effective. But if you hear from someone in your network, someone close to you that says, hey, let's make a plan together to go to the polls, we know that that's far more effective. And so we've really leaned into relational organizing as one of our tactics. Also, it's great to be able to get some money into the pocket of young people when we have an affordability challenge. So relational organizing has been really important. On-campus poll walking has been critical. And then that phone banking is a lot of people say young people don't answer the phones, but we talk to them.
I'm curious. I'm sure young people, one of the things, whether it's your friends or people that you are campaigning with are saying is they might tend to say, my vote doesn't matter. We hear it all the time, unfortunately. Tell me, if you had their ears, what would you tell them and sort of say they're wrong?
There's 2 things I always say to a young person when they say my vote doesn't matter. The first thing I say is your vote counts the same as someone in power. You have an equal weighted vote to any other individual who goes to the polls. So you getting to the polls is important. By not showing up, you're releasing that power to the people who you say don't listen to you. The other thing I say is, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric around like, youth are apathetic. Youth are not apathetic. We've seen student movements be loud and proud. We know that youth care. Voting is a collective act, but I also offer to people, it's also an individual act. When you feel overwhelmed, when you feel anxious about the state of the world, you're stressed out about climate, you're stressed about mental health, tuition, rent, I have an option for you that can help you, the individual, feel a little bit less anxious. That's by taking action. We know all of the studies show that the way to reduce anxiety is through agency or through action.
Right.
And every individual can vote. So one of the most effective tactics I use is not persuasion. It's not at all talking about the parties. What I say is, are you stressed today? Do you want to do something today to get that really great dopamine hit of checking something off your list? Come with me right now. Let's cast your ballot and you can say you did something towards those issues that you care about.
Very good. All right, we have 1 minute left. We have 4 days before people can start, putting in their sort of their last ballots there. What are some easy ways for folks to become politically engaged within the next few days?
you want to go to the Elections Ontario website. That is your main official source of information. So you'll see lots of different political parties getting your attention. You'll see the mainstream news, there's social media, and I would say, of course, look up your candidate information, find out who your local candidates are, and then look at their platforms and the issues that matter to you and what those candidates are offering. But most importantly, if you have one job between now and February 27th, it's for you to make a concrete plan with yourself and a buddy to vote. So I want you to know, how are you going to get there? I want you to know when you're going to go. I want you to make a plan, get your friends involved, because as soon as you make that concrete logistical plan to vote, I have confidence that we will see an increase in voter turnout across the province.
I feel like I know the answer to this question, but have you voted yet?
You know what? I haven't voted yet. Yes.
We're waiting until the 27th?
I am waiting till the 27th. I am all about that high energy election day voting, and so I'm bringing my children, and we're really excited. We have our plan to vote after school on the 27th.
All right, very good. Amanda, thank you so much for the 411 on all of this. It was great.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a frustrating election campaign for people trying to advance the cause of those living with disabilities. Donald Trump's tariffs, hallway healthcare, and a shortage of primary care have dominated the narrative, leaving little bandwidth for much else. So let's spend some time with David Lepofsky, chair of a group called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. He joins us now from London, Ontario. Welcome to the program, David.
Great to talk to you.
All right, because of the focus on tariffs and healthcare, what have we not talked about related to disability issues that we should have been?
There are a number of pressing disability issues that matter to 2.9 million Ontarians who now have a disability, and all other Ontarians who are going to get a disability as they get older. Let me just tell you about one. Our province was by law required to become accessible to people with disabilities by the start of this year. That was the requirement of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, passed 20 years ago with a 20-year deadline. Well, guess what? New Year's Day came. We still live in a province full of physical barriers, technology barriers, bureaucratic barriers that impede people with disabilities who try to get a job or get an education or ride public transit or just go shopping. Well, this election was called right after the government blew it on this deadline. So we were ready, and we called on the parties to each make an Accessible Ontario pledge to specify what they would do to fulfill the commitment in the Disabilities Act, even though we failed to meet the deadline. And 3 of the parties have answered with detailed commitments: the Greens, the NDP, and the Liberals. The Conservatives have not even answered. Similarly, in the 2022 election, the other parties made commitments to us, and the Tories did not answer. Now, we're nonpartisan. We're not out to campaign for or against or to support or oppose any party. We want all the parties to make these commitments, so we've done 2 things. We've tried as best we can on social media and every way we can to get the Conservatives to make a commitment. They didn't answer. Last week, an all-candidates debate was scheduled on disability issues in Toronto with a number of disability organizations, of which we were part, organizing it. All the parties sent representatives, again, except the Conservative Party. So we tried to give them a chance there to present what they'd be prepared to do. So that's where we're at. And sadly, a number of the mainstream media outlets have not told voters this. So voters are being told by the media, what the polls are saying, but they're not being given the information they really need so they can decide what their priorities are.
David, you had mentioned those commitments from the other parties. Can you walk me through some of these commitments?
Under the Disabilities Act, there's supposed to be effective enforcement. Right now, the enforcement is paltry and, frankly, pathetic. The Minister for Accessibility, Raymond Cho, says it's working. Well, he's the minister responsible, but unfortunately his track record on enforcement has been, respectfully, abysmal. Now, we need to get in place accessibility standards so people know what they got to do. There are a few that have been passed, but no new ones have been passed since 2012. For example, 250,000 or more students with disabilities in Ontario-funded schools face incredible barriers that impede them from getting a good education, and you need a good education to get a good job. So what happened was the government committed to enact an accessibility standard for education. That's good. The government had in place an expert advisory committee to recommend what it should include. I had the privilege of serving on that, honored to do it. But over 3 years ago, it rendered its report, and subsequently the government's done nothing. So we need an education standard for them. Finally, there's lots more, but just in brief, it is absolutely important the government not use public money to create new accessibility barriers. 2 years ago, the government opened a brand new courthouse in the heart of downtown Toronto, a criminal trial courthouse. Cost almost $1 billion. Well, it was $1 billion accessibility bungle because we released a video last August, which has gotten thousands of views, which shows that this building was replete with accessibility barriers, and that we warned the government about these well before any shovel went in the ground. I invite our viewers to go online and just search on $1 billion accessibility bungle, and you will see in vivid detail what I'm talking about.
All right. I want to talk about something that has been discussed on the campaign trail. Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP. I think it was the Liberals who got out there first promising to double payments for ODSP. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the three opposition parties, Liberals, Greens, and NDP, have now said that they will all double ODSP. This is really important because people with disabilities disproportionately live below the poverty line and are dependent on social assistance. Well, the social assistance they get, which is the Ontario Disability Support Plan, or ODSP, it is legislated poverty. It leaves you well below the poverty line. So doubling that amount would be a major step forward for people with disabilities. Now, the federal government back in 2020 said they would enact the Canada Disability Benefit to top up these provincial benefits, but unfortunately, what they ended up enacting is going to max out at maximum $200 a month, and it hasn't even started to flow yet. We don't know what's going to happen if there's a spring federal election. So the provincial action is absolutely essential to reach out a hand to many people with disabilities who are languishing in poverty and whose escape from poverty is impeded by the barriers to get a good education and the barriers to get a good job that the failed Disabilities Act was supposed to fix.
All right, David, can you rank what's on offer from the four major parties, best to worst?
Well, in terms of the accessibility requirements and needs, it's simple. The three opposition parties have made detailed commitments. There are minor differences between them, but I wouldn't characterize it as major. And the Conservatives, who have promised nothing, there's still time. If they promised it tomorrow, we'd be cheering and we'd be publicizing it as widely as we can. In fact, if any Conservatives are listening to us, please get to your party leader and tell him to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge. I would have made the pitch to him personally, but unfortunately, Doug Ford's the only premier in the past 2 decades who's refused to even meet us.
All right, David, I'm going to ask, you kind of have given us, sort of a year-by-year look at sort of the PC government's record. Can you evaluate Doug Ford's record on disability over the years?
Well, I would say that it has been, we've characterized it in terms of accessibility as being abysmal. I will say that other disability advocates have raised major concerns in other areas. Now, if you think back to the last election, 2022, if memory serves, and correct me if I get this wrong, but we went into the 2022 election with the province announcing a budget, and the budget included no ODSP increase at all. Now, that became a campaign issue right at the start of the campaign. And to their credit, the Tories then came forward with a commitment to an increase to ODSP. And that increase is, of course, important and helpful. But it is nothing like what we've got right now.
Has Doug Ford done anything to make Ontario more accessible?
I can't say they've done nothing. What I can say is they've done far less than they should, and that in key ways they've made things worse. By building new infrastructure like the new Toronto courthouse with barriers, they've made things considerably worse. Remember we had a big fracas last fall about bike lanes?
Right.
Well, unfortunately, a number of municipalities are building new bike lanes on top of sidewalks, not at street level. This is very dangerous for blind people like me who can't know that the sidewalk that we thought was safe is actually a dangerous bike path. So we wrote the Tories, the Doug Ford government, when they had this bike lane legislation before the legislature, and said, we didn't take a position on whether we supported or opposed their bike lane legislation, but we said, if you are regulating bike lanes, could you please forbid municipalities or anybody else from building bike lanes at sidewalk level that endanger people with disabilities, personally I will say, like me? Well, they didn't. So they actually missed huge opportunities, and in a number of key ways have made things worse.
David, we have about 30 seconds left, and I want to ask you one more question. If a party wanted to be responsive to disability issues here in this province, tell us 3 things that they have to have in their platform.
Enacting an accessibility standard in healthcare to tear down barriers facing patients, and an education standard, an accessibility standard in education, tearing down barriers facing students with disabilities, implementing effective enforcement of the law so we don't reward lawbreakers or leave them at liberty to be lawbreakers, and finally, a comprehensive strategy so that we never again use public money to make things worse by creating new barriers.
David, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Take care. Thank you very much for including me.
Thank you. That is the agenda for Monday, February 24th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, we look at what the parties are promising for the education system. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.